The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss. We are now halfway through Schoenberg's 5 Pieces for Orchestra. I'm starting off this lecture with the 2-piano score as prepared by Webern, who was a pupil of Schoenberg. This is part of the Second Viennese School, which I think if you really enjoy this kind of music and you want to learn more about it, you should explore. But it will be very familiar to a lot of other viewers. The reason why I want us to look at this piano score is that the full orchestral score is going to look a bit confusing. A lot of the harmonies, very, very simple scoring, is very spread out, and it's kind of hard to grasp the exact nature of what's going on. Here we can see that Webern has boiled it all down to the most basic functions. And what we see are chords that sort of step on each other's toes, if you see what I mean. When the chords change on the beat, the dovetailing changes so that the next chord will agree with it. And it's not just the chords in the right hand, it's also these bass notes. So you can see that this note right here lasts for 1.5 beats. And right on the second beat, this comes in and just overlaps just a tiny little bit from the previous note in the other piano. In this case, it would be the other instrument in the orchestra. And we've also got these G sharps as well. Webern could have easily made these all line up. Like, for instance, having this chord right here line up with this G sharp, just to make it all sort of the same exact incidence. But he breaks it up between the hands, and that makes it much more interesting and integrated for the two players. You can also see that there are little extra notes that are thrown in there from time to time. There's one here, and then we've got these little descending stacked fifths. And even this chord that sort of carries over ties from one staff to another, which I must say is a very intriguing way to score. Not that this would be technically all that difficult to play. It would just involve holding the hands down on all of these pitches, changing the pedal, and then putting the pedal back down to hold what's left of the resonance of those previous pitches, and then starting in again. Well, it really doesn't matter what the pianos are doing for their own sake here, because aside from just being a fun way to play this with 2 pianos, it's a great score that will help you to study the harmony of what's going on here. Now, I am really going to avoid commenting on the exact constituents of the harmony in this particular lecture. And the reason why is because I know very, very well that of all of the movements in this piece, this is the one that gets studied at universities. And I don't want to be the crib notes for 1,000 classrooms out there. I am just going to talk about how the orchestration works, and that is it. Now, as far as the harmony relates to different elements, to the identities of each note and how they support the harmony, I will be commenting on that. But I don't want to be the source for papers on Schoenberg's early harmony, okay? So, with all of that said, let's look at the full score. And you can see the original title of Farben, which just means colors in English, has been expanded a little bit to Summer Morning by a Lake. This was also known as chord colors, right? To be very specific about what kind of coloration that Schoenberg was talking about. Now here we see all of the elements that we saw in the piano score. We see the low notes stepping on each other's toes, right here, overlapping, rather than dovetailing. The term dovetailing really should be applied when there is a sense that one pitch is being taken over by another and it's intended to be a seamless continuation. But this is really overlapping in a way with the same note being played by two different instruments, in this case alternating back and forth, so continuously overlapping. And the overlapping is intended to be a pulse, right? So this sets up a pulse where there's just a little bit of overhang from the previous note. So it really keeps this sort of pulsing, hanging sensation going on, whether that is on every beat, as we see here, or every other beat in terms of the way that the chords are set up. And this first page is probably the easiest to analyze because that rhythmic pattern that we just discussed stays pretty much constant throughout this entire screen, and the harmony just changes little by little. Sometimes 3 bars in a row, and sometimes it just hangs for a few bars, as we see here. And then, of course, the context of the harmony here at the end is changed by these low notes. First, you're seeing this bass clarinet line come in here, and then we've got third trombone and first clarinet, in this case playing an open ninth, which is echoed almost immediately on different pitches, lower pitches, by 3 solo double basses, which are also playing an open ninth. Stacked fifths is another way of referring to that particular harmony. Now, do you recall that chord that tied over from one staff to the next in the second piano with the 2-piano score? Here's that chord right here. And that is realized on 4 solo cellos, all playing Sol C. That's a pretty high note to be playing Sol C, all the way up to A flat there. But I guess it's possible. Cellos have a tremendous reach. It'll just be very difficult for the player to nail with the intonation, and they might be actually like surreptitiously checking exactly where they come in, or they may have even set the note just before the movement started. If it were a case where there was a recording session and they had to absolutely get it perfect, no way to adjust it once they hit it dead on. Now that is all of the little extras that are a part of what's going on here. And forgive me when I just mentioned the cellos here for neglecting to mention that there is this low contrabassoon note right in here, which is functioning as kind of a 5th cello way down here. And actually this is a wonderful sound. Solo cellos and contrabassoon playing a very, very low note, very, very softly. Contrabassoons can play tremendously soft in their ideal range. So this middle of the bass staff range, they can be extremely subtle. So that is everything that is playing around all of these other bits. But what is actually really happening with the main texture here? And that is, not to really get into the harmony too much, as I said before, but it is a form of 13th chord. So in this case, a C major 13 sharp 5, right? So our sharp 5s are being supplied as sounding G sharps, which you see here in the bassoon at first. And then our 13 is the A here, right? And if you just add the sort of stack, which we see in jazz a lot. The 13th chord will be expressed by the right hand playing stacked perfect fourths. So in this case, this written C sharp is a B, B, E, and A. And then, of course, the low note is this open C here. This is, of course, a solo viola trading off with a solo double bass note. And this is something that I've discussed before in my Mac Pro Video orchestration courses, and that is there is a very strong similarity of timbre between double basses and violas. And my caution was to avoid scoring the same registers between the two instruments because one might dampen out the other one very, very easily. Well, in this case, it works because they're both solo instruments, and they're both doing this little game of stepping on each other's toes, of overlapping slightly on each beat. So that actually just adds to the sense of mystery. Schoenberg is really a fantastic orchestrator, and this idea here of these two very closely related timbres, but of course being from very different instruments, is a beautiful one, especially when you consider that this instrument, in terms of its body, is so much smaller than the double bass, which has a hugely resonant cavity. But that difference in resonance also contributes to the sense of pulse, right? It's almost like breathing. This whole idea of the chords overlapping slightly just really reminds me of a form of breathing. So just looking at how these chords are constructed now in terms of the way that they're laid out across the orchestra. Perfect fourths and flutes in a low register with clarinet at the bottom. This is a great way of avoiding having to put in an alto flute. Now, this could actually have been played by a third flute, the B at the bottom here, the sounding B. That could have been played by just a standard flute using a B foot. But then that limits the low range of that note. So if Schoenberg wants to move it around, move it up or down or so on, the third voice in the chord, then he is just limited by what the range of that third flute would be. So it's better just to use the clarinet, especially when you consider we've got this written C sounding B flat, which most flutes would not have, what pretty much every standard flute would not have. There is a B flat asked for by Tchaikovsky in one of his pieces, and I've heard of all sorts of different ways of trying to fake that B flat note, including resting the end of the flute up against the player's knee or against the stand or something else to just kind of fake that B flat note. But that's not a concern here because we've got our clarinet playing in the upper Chalumeau register, which is just a perfect way to blend with low flutes. And then, as I mentioned before, the second bassoon is taking over this G sharp, and of course, viola on the bottom, right? So what's interesting about this shifting back and forth on each beat is that the viola is always going to be playing the bottom of each of these alternating chords, but just shifting back and forth in between as each chord is being sustained for just those two beats. We'll feel a shifting on the bass of color. Okay, so clarinet, flutes above, bassoon on the bottom. To some extent, that color would just be a natural one in terms of range. Schoenberg could have also put oboe on top of there, or English horn and first clarinet. But this beautiful sense of the flute, the softness of it, adding just a little bit of clarinet below and very soft bassoon, makes this just a pastel-like color, a wonderfully realized harmony. So that is going to alternate with the same exact pitches on other instruments. In this case, English horn on top, sounding down a perfect fifth, so it's that same A. And then as far as this E is concerned, that is being played by second trumpet, muted trumpet. Then this low written C sharp sounding B is being played by first bassoon, and then on the very, very bottom, the G sharp, written D sharp, is being played by muted horn. So just think about that shifting of texture. And that is maintained throughout this entire page. We have the low flutes on top, clarinet, bassoon, and then we've got English horn on top. And English horn can actually play extremely softly and subtly. And if you have a good player, they can try to match the flute sound and get very, very close. English horn can also match a soft clarinet sound as well when it's playing extremely soft like this. But consider how the positions of things have changed, with the first bassoon taking that third position in the chord, that middle position. And then we've got sort of mid-range and low trumpet encompassing that B note on the bassoon. And then, of course, the viola at the bottom. And what's lovely about this is that the changes of harmony, while we might be thinking, oh, of course he's just modulating, or well, you don't really modulate in atonal music, but he's just changing chords for harmonic interest. But that's not it at all. Well, yes, there is harmonic interest happening here, but the effect of the chord change is psychological, right? It is not mechanical or necessarily theoretical. The change of the chord is to bring out a different orchestral texture or color from the same exact stacking of instruments. So you can really feel the colors shifting. In an earlier lecture, I referred to this effect as being similar to a lighting technician, say for a big rock and roll show, just very, very subtly changing the colors of different sets of lights, fading them in and out. And that's what I feel really becomes apparent here when you hear the harmony change. So it's a wonderful way of using harmony, and the fact that Schoenberg avoids any sense of common practice harmony here is really what makes it work. This is where I feel Richard Strauss failed the most in terms of his friendship with Schoenberg and understanding where his music was coming from. Even if he had just programmed this one piece at his Berlin concerts, I think that would have changed that from a mistake into an inspiration, because this piece is so powerful in terms of what it expresses, in terms of how it changes the way that music can be heard and listened to. It's just as significant a change as a few years before, 1905, when Ravel wrote the first piece of ambient music, The Valley of the Bells, from the Miroir suite. So that is kind of proto-ambient music. This, in a way, approaches that, I would say, that level of separating musical elements from each other so that the experience of music can be one that is really detached from your intellect, right? Now, saying that, the irony of this is that this piece is one of the biggest intellectual exercises of all time, and the proof of that is in all of the papers that many people out there watching this are going to have to take as part of their university courses. This is the movement that gets analyzed the most, I would say. and my heartfelt sympathies go out to you. But it just really is ironic that this piece is supposed to kind of remove you from the intellectual expectations of the way musical form works, with certain chord progressions and modulations leading to create expectations with the listener, and this just completely shuts all that down. And that's why I really feel that this is not just the middle movement of this piece, but it really is the central aesthetic of the entire conception. If only Strauss had realized that, or maybe he did realize that all too well, and felt that that in itself was an insult to his aesthetic. It could be hard from one perspective to imagine him missing that, but easy from another one, if he allowed his outrage upon reading the first couple of movements to color his perception of this particular movement. But all that aside, it's just really a wonderful piece of music. One little thing I'm going to mention here, and that is, notice how the viola line here, these little low notes that alternate with the bass notes, gives over to contrabassoon. I think that is such an interesting idea, to have contrabassoon try to match the tone of the viola or substitute for it. So I would imagine that the contrabassoonist would be listening to that viola line happening just before and just really trying to nail it. Not necessarily trying to sound like a viola, but trying not to sound like not a viola. Do you see what I mean? To supply something that will not disturb the surface of this perfect musical lake that Schoenberg is imagining. Of course, there is a completely functional reason why the contrabassoon is taking over here. If you really just look at the way this passage ends, you can see why. That is that this is a B, concert B2, which is just below C1, which is that open string of the viola, which the viola cannot reach unless they were to play scordatura, the B, the low B. They could not reach that without changing their strings tuning. So Schoenberg just needs some instrument to come in there and continue to alternate with this solo double bass. And it can't be really a cello, right? Because the cello tone maybe is a little bit too close to the double bass, and he really wants the sound of the cello to be something unique in here. So what he does is he splits the difference, right? He has the contrabassoon act as a sort of a bass viola, and then has it come in finally to underpin this cello chord, so long as the contrabassoonist is in that mindset of sounding as subtle as possible and not perturbing the string-like sound that is underpinning everything. And of course, there's this wonderful little tuba plus first clarinet going on here, which is really lovely. But nothing else changes, except for just harmonically, and in terms of the context with these new low notes. In the recording that I'm about to play, you'll notice that the bass clarinet is just so subtle under there, and is almost more of a feeling than a sound. That is something that bass clarinetists can do so well, just insinuate themselves. I almost feel like, having shown that level of subtlety, the players who play afterwards have to just deal with that and think, oh wow, how am I going to match that level of non-interference? And of course, when you get to hear these big open fifths in the double basses, it's really hard to avoid it being sort of boisterous, but the players do their best. And then of course, this is just wonderful at the end here, when everything comes together in this lovely chord. So let's have a listen to that now. One last little thing, this is funny to be doing this last rather than first, is just notice that even though this is an extremely subtle movement, it's the most subtle of them all, it still has a very, very big orchestra involved. I'm not going to enumerate every single instrument, but just notice that it really is the full ensemble. 4 flutes, 3 oboe family members, 4 clarinet family members, 3 bassoons, and so on. We've got our 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, tuba, and it is such a soft piece. You may well be asking, what do we need all those players for? And the answer is that a full ensemble can play subtle textures in ways that a smaller ensemble can't, in terms of intensely layering, and you can even develop the most powerful sense of suspense and impending doom or tension or other kinds of disturbed feelings with large ensembles like this that really layer and alternate in eerie ways and in wonderfully colorful ways, which we'll study on the next couple of screens. Let's go back to the piano score. Right here at the beginning of what will be the next screen of full score, you can see these little notes here coming out of the texture. First we have a B flat, then we have a G plus a B flat, then E flat here, which ties over, and then this G right in here with a C flat at the bottom. From this point, the alternating chords pick up again, and just as a point of interest, they are down a half step from the opening, right? We've got this stack of perfect fourths starting on a B below with C natural and G sharp, and here we've got C flat and G natural and B flat stacked fourths. Okay, this is going to continue in the same vein with the chords overlapping on each other's pitches, and that same sense of pulse on the beat, right, with the C flat going back and forth, changing to a D, going back and forth, and so on. Now, insinuating into this score is the sense of little bits of color and function, programmatic in a way. If you go back to the descriptive name of this movement, Summer Morning by a Lake, then you could think of these as little bird sounds and other little distractions, right? So here we've got this high B, we've got these maybe tweets or flutters, and going on, there's something similar on the next page. Let's see how that looks on the full score. So here you can see those tweets and flutters, this rising fragment in first clarinet, which is doubled by harp, then ending on a celesta chord right here. Then on the second beat, this is very confusing, by the way this is all notated out. These are intended to be divisi first violins, further divided by 2 staves. for 4 separate parts. And they're all intended to be half notes falling right here in the middle of the staff. And Schoenberg has taken the time to notate out exactly what he wants, or rather his publisher or copyist has taken the time to say, okay, well, this is an artificial harmonic on a B, and that is this pitch right up here, ottava B. But there are different ways of scoring this. I recommend this way right here. You do not need to show the pitches. Any professional violinist of today will be able to understand if you've got the pitch below where the finger sits and then the node that is being touched by the other finger, that they will end up getting these pitches. They will know what those pitches are going to be. And in fact, I'm actually working on a tip for 100 more orchestration tips that talks about this exact particular point of notating artificial harmonics, especially when you have very, very high pitches that you intend to play, as another way of avoiding having to write out ottava, right? The very thing that is happening here you can avoid, and that's what this is intended to supply to a degree. Okay, so rising line ending with celesta, and then here we've got these artificial harmonics forming a 4-part chord, which ends with this harp roll and these tweedles going down, which are essentially doubled in octaves between the piccolo and the flute. You will get that very percussive sound that I talked about before, where you feel like you're hearing xylophone or some other very harsh, somewhat clanging sound, but it's just the force and the sudden opening of your ear that causes you to feel that it's percussive. This is actually another orchestration tip that I'm preparing about the realities of high piccolo registers. And we've got something similar happening here with the celesta and harp playing right off of this, and of course following the English horn playing something similar to what the first clarinet did. Okay, well, that's all very, very cool, but I talked about it first because I didn't want to distract from the chord colors, which is really the thrust here. That's really what you should be focusing on. All of these other things are kind of like a distraction. They take your attention away from the really intriguing ways that all of these harmonies are trading off between different types of orchestration. And the orchestration is really what fascinates me, the way that these textures are being built. There was a post that was shared in Orchestration Online a couple days ago in which a youth orchestra conductor, Benjamin Zander, had marked up the first page of Mahler 1 and written all kinds of notes all over it. And I was interested to see that so many people thought that that was wrong, right? Some people were offended by it. Some people were, frankly, hostile to the whole idea, which is the most normal thing in the world for a conductor to be writing all over their score. It's not sacrilege. There are going to be many printed copies of the same score, but the one that is going to be used by the conductor, of course, is a set of instructions. And the conductor is going to add instructions to that, especially if they're working with a youth orchestra, where they have to remind the players to do certain things that professionals wouldn't need to be reminded of. In the context of a page like this, there might be dozens of little reminders of where to look, of how certain things line up together. So if the conductor needs to tune something in rehearsal, he might know exactly where the problem is. He might be thinking, oh, that particular note is very difficult on that particular instrument to tune, so I better circle that and just, maybe help the player through that. Or if there's some sort of sectional on a particular piece, that particular note can be fixed. But you wouldn't need a sectional on this because it's so integrated, right? There just wouldn't be any point. But having said all that, let's start here at the beginning of the screen. And here we've got Staccato Harp playing these 4 pitches. And this is punctuation for the beginnings of these notes. Now here, for some reason, the B flat did not come through when it was scanned to be uploaded to IMSLP. So right here, this is a B flat starting on the second beat of the bar, which is being played by the harp as well. So it almost sounds as if the tone of the sustained harp is to be played with half the second violins, right? It's a form of mixing together different attacks and sustains that was done. I think Korg did this. They had a synthesizer where you could have like the attack of a trumpet mixed to like the tone of a flute or something like that. You could mix and match different attacks and sustains and so on. So this is an early example of that. So Schoenberg is having the harp basically be the attack for all of these sustained tones. And triple P to double P for the sustained tones, it's really going to be the other way around. This is going to be playing like mezzo piano to really come through. So the concert pitch of B flat, and then this continues. The concert pitch of G, here being expressed by third or fourth horn, with the first trombone coming in to reinforce that B flat, just as it is in the piano part. Then concert E flat, written as third trumpet F natural. Then finally this A flat here, which is being played by the first bassoon. And when we get to this note here, this high A flat, that's the beginning of our chord colors again. So just looking at how these chords are stacked, remember that the general shape is to be played as a form of 13th chord. And then of course, Schoenberg changes the chords around as he goes. But starting off from here, we've got this tenor clef A flat. Not too hard to play. That's kind of the upper limit of tones that the bassoonist could probably play in an extremely controlled, soft way, blending into other textures. And you start getting above A flat, like A natural, B flat, and then of course C, which is the first note of the Rite of Spring. Then you're getting into a place where the intonation is becoming more and more difficult, and also just the sense of absolute perfect control in a very subtle texture like this, right? We're just getting out of bounds for that. Okay, so top note of A flat right here. And then the next note down would have to be an E flat, right? And that is being played by second clarinet, written as concert F. Below that, E flat, we need a B flat, which is being played by second violin. And then, of course, we just have to worry about the G natural and the C flat. So here's your G natural in second trombone. And your C flat is being written here as a G flat in the second horn. So that is the way that this is all put together. Just think about that color, though. You know, bassoon, clarinet, second violin, trombone, and then muted second horn. And that is just an amazing color. Just really incredible. Now we're going to break down some more of these chords in terms of what the layout is. And this is something you can follow along with on another computer looking at the 2-piano score, if that helps. But let's deal with one thing first, and that is the pulsing bass line. Okay, so it starts to come in a little unevenly at first. We've got this C flat here, as I mentioned before. Then here, written D flat, sounding C flat, a ninth below. written in treble clef, sounding bass clef C flat 3. Now here's a place where what's in the piano score does not quite match what's in the orchestral score. There's a missing low pulsing note. Here, the second horn plays on the fourth beat instead of the third beat, and then the bass clarinet comes in right on the downbeat. Then we've got those pitches sort of trading off in the middle. This is written E, sounding D3, a ninth below, and this is also D3, right in the middle of the bar. And then from this point, we're going to see some trading off. That is more regular, just on every single beat. What's interesting about this is that Schoenberg avoids having the same two instruments trading off as he had in the previous page, where it was just viola and double bass going back and forth, with contrabassoon eventually substituting for viola. Here he's going to go between three different instruments in a bit of a daisy chain. So, starting with bass clarinet, right here, that next D is going to be played by solo viola, and then contrabassoon, then solo double bass, back to viola, back to contrabassoon. At that point, the bass clarinet drops out for a little bit, and we just have this continuing chain of double bass, viola, and contrabassoon going back and forth for a bit. This is going to continue on, and then right about here, Schoenberg drops out the viola and then goes double bass, second horn again, playing that same D as a written A, and then contrabassoon taking over. He does that again, double bass, horn, contrabassoon, double bass, back to bass clarinet, contrabassoon, and so on. Double bass, bass clarinet, contra. And this goes on pretty much to the end of the page. So that is how he's dealing with the bass line. And what's great about it is that that shifting keeps the ear from really settling on anything. Not to mention all the other changes back and forth between color that we're going to explore in a second. I would say it would be a great way to hone your orchestrator's ear to try to make out the differences. This is one of those pages where you could just listen to it for a dozen times in a row for different types of elements. When I was 16 years old, I learned the Rite of Spring almost as a conductor would, by studying the score over and over and over again till I practically had the whole thing memorized. One of the things that I did was, because I didn't have any training, I didn't have anybody standing over my shoulder, I went through the entire work over and over again, just focusing on different parts. At first studying the violins, the first violins and then the second violins and so on. That was easy, and the higher woodwinds, like flutes and E-flat clarinet, oboe, and English horn. Those were instruments that were often soloing or at the top of a held chord. So it was pretty easy to follow them, but then following the internal voices, that was a lot more challenging. And that's something else you could do here. You could actually just buy this score or print off the score from IMSLP and get out your highlighter and highlight different notes in different positions if you really wanted to be thorough about it. But I'll just talk over some of it with you right now. Now that we've established that bass function, then some of these notes that are appearing are not going to be so confusing and distracting, right? And of course, these little tweets and flutters, I've already described pretty much all of them except for this little celesta right in here, which is just sweetening some of this piccolo right in here. This really reminds me a lot of Mahler, actually. Some of the flute tweets. And it's not a tribute to Mahler, and it's not a quote of Mahler, but it's just some of his more simplistic way of interpreting tweeting by birds, rather than being incredibly literal about it, just adding a few little chirps or little repeated notes to represent that. Let's go back to the chord structures. We're going to be repeating that same exact chord again. This time C flat, major 13, sharp 5, right? The sharp 5 being G natural. So the top note of A flat is going to be repeated, this time in muted first violins, played Sol G. So that's your top note. Then the next note down of E flat is being played by very soft English horn, which I feel is an enormously effective note. Below that, we still need our B flat, and the B flat is being supplied by second trombone. Then under that, we need our G, which is being played by third or fourth horn. I sort of chop these pages up, and sometimes I don't carry over which instrument was playing what, but it doesn't really matter in this case. And then low C flat is being supplied, as we spoke of before, by bass clarinet. It would probably take me a whole hour to go through the way that all of these chords are voiced across the orchestra in the different harmonic colors. But let me just point out a few things, and you can work out the rest for yourself. One is this oboe note right here in the middle. Just really stands out, these B's on oboe, and they're intended to. They are speaking a little loudly, but they just add this wonderful character to the music. Let's pick a chord from the very middle just to see how this entire texture has evolved. Let's start right here. We've got clarinet in E flat, playing a concert C5, so C above middle C. Then the next note down is an F sharp, and that is being played by second bassoon. Then below that we've got a C sharp, which is enharmonically D flat, being written up a fifth as A flat by English horn. Then below that we've got a B flat in the second violins. And then of course just the D and the bass pulsing back and forth between the different instruments. How about one towards the end here? And then I'll let you listen to this page yourself. Just cutting through all of these distractions that are starting to build up, and there will be even more on the next page. Let's check out the chord right at the beginning of this last bar. We're going back to stacked fourths, which in the piano part is written as B flat, E flat, A flat, and then beneath there is a little E natural third, so E and G, and that is written out as bassoon on top again, playing the A flat. And then for our E flat, we've got this lovely high solo cello covering that particular part of the chord. On B flat, we've got muted trombone once again. Second clarinet is covering the G, here written as A. And then, of course, in the bass, we have got the E natural, and here it's being played by third trombone, which is just dovetailing into that texture, taking the place of bass clarinet. So what you'll see if you really do break down each one of these chords laboriously is that each time Schoenberg has devised a different, unique color that actually is wonderfully effective. And I'm sure that this takes a lot of time to prepare, say at the conservatory level or say a semi-pro orchestra. It's the kind of thing that you would really, really want to study hard so you'd be able to play it very, very well as a professional later on. And I'm sure that there are some of these textures that just really take a lot of time to nail, even as a pro orchestra. How about just one more chord? Okay, right here in the middle of this bar. This one is really worth pointing out. Here we've got a stack of fourths, C sharp, F sharp, and B in the right hand and the piano part. And then in the left hand, there's a D minor sixth, D in the bass, and then B flat in the middle. So that is interpreted in this very cool way by B on top with first oboe. The F sharp is being covered by this written C sharp in English horn. The C sharp is being enharmonically interpreted as a D flat written E flat. And then the B flat at the top of the left hand in the piano score is being covered by the first bassoon. So once again, that is a wonderful chord, very much a double reed kind of a chord, seeing as how the muted trumpet will have a very complicit kind of a sound that works really well in subtle textures with the double reeds. But you can see how those textures evolve, right? Maybe starting in bassoon and clarinets, then we've got English horn, and then becoming more centered around oboe as the top note, and so on. Or having strings as the top note, or contributing more in the middle from time to time. And this wonderful shifting of colors keeps the ear from just really settling on anything. And yet each chord is just wonderfully worked out. And probably very few of them are out of balance or would require any extra pushing from any particular player in order to make balance. And yet, it probably still is a lot of work to put together at first at the conservatory level. As you can see, even though these sections aren't all that long, they still contain a vast amount of information. And I really want you to be able to soak up as much of it as you can from these lectures. Having shared a few of these diagrams with you as I went along, I might do a special version that diagrams out some of this movement, so you can watch it in real time along to a recording, and compare the way that the different colors shift from place to place over the same chords.